Hey everybody, I'm Scott Graham, Extension Entomologist with Alabama Cooperative Extension System at Auburn University. Today I've been asked to kind of give a run through of some of the common insect pests that we find in cotton. Now, although most of our work is in Alabama, we do work a lot in the southern part of the state. Every now and then we get across the state line into Florida and look at some problem fields and things like that. So we feel like we've got a pretty good handle on what's going on, and certainly in cotton production in that latitude. And a lot of the insect issues and stuff that we deal with in South Alabama are very similar to what's going on in Florida. So let's kind of walk through the season now, looking at the different pests that we dealt with in 2020 and kind of thinking in 2021 how we should manage these pests going forward. So really, this year the biggest yield limiting factor we had was, the late season hurricanes and things like that. For the most part, insects weren't a major yield limiting factor for us this year. We did make several treatments, but no one particular pest really dominated the scene. Sometimes it was more of these minor pests and secondary pests that caused us so much more heartburn than our major pests. Cotton is one of those crops where we're in it at least once a week for 12, 13 weeks or so. A lot of decisions are made based on when to spray, when not to spray, things like that. So let's talk a little bit about what we saw this year and what we learned and moving forward where we need to go. So my plan is kind of to walk through the season. I was kind of looking at a logical order of when these pests typically start to show up in the field and start, threatening our cotton stands and things like that. So first we'll talk about early season pests, which are, a problem from emergence through the seedling stage. A lot of times if we can get up to the 5th, 6th true leaf stage at that point, we're kind of through that seedling window where some of these pests can do damage, and we start worrying then more about, once we get into the squaring season. But let's walk through a couple of these different pests and just kind of talk about management decisions and things like that moving through the season. So first we'll talk about a couple of pests that actually aren't insects. That would be snails and slugs. Now here you see some images of some snails from a field that Dr. Ron Smith and I went and looked at in Walton County, Florida this past spring. And with snails, they're a little bit different. From as far as we know, they don't actually feed on any of the leaves. So the damage that these snails are actually doing is just from the weight of the sheer number of snails that will crawl up on a cotton seedling and then cause the main stem there to break over, as you see in these images here. Now it's going to take a lot of snails to do this. Not often probably that we're going to see widespread economic loss from snails, but they're a problem. They seem to be every year becoming more and more of an issue. So it's just something that we've got to try to figure something out to do. Insecticides do not work on snails, unfortunately, so that causes an issue for us. Now, a difference in snails and slugs, which we'll talk about next, is snails have shells. You'll see them on plants during the day. Typically with slugs, they tend to hide underneath plant stubble and residues and things like that. So here's some images of some classic slug damage. So in the top right image there, we see kind of those irregular shaped holes that are chewed out of the sides of the leaves. That's classic slug damage feeding up on the plant. Also, you can see where they'll cut through the stem, similar to if you think of cutworm damage, and lay the plants over, and then they'll feed on them there. Then you see an image actually of kind of a little slimy little slug there on top of a plant that I've actually staged that photograph. Typically with slugs, during the day they're going to be hiding down underneath that residue. They're not actually going to be up in the leaves. They tend to kind of hide out and stay where it's cool and moist. And with both of these pests, that's a key characteristic for when we see fields infested with these mollusks, is cool, wet conditions. Now, particularly with slugs, we tend to see them following grass crops such as corn or grain sorghum. So if we're going into planting into a wet spring and we're going cotton behind corn or cotton behind grain sorghum, that's something to think about. These slugs may be in the field ready to eat. As I mentioned with snails, insecticides have no efficacy on slugs whatsoever. They're not insects, so that's not an option. There are some different baits and things available that are, in my experience, pretty expensive and not very effective. So that's not really a way to go that's viable for our growers. Really the best thing to do is either wait until we get good growing conditions, or maybe try to do a little light tillage. If you're in a no-till situation, disturb the soil, try to kill some of those slugs that way. Really, the only option we've got to manage these guys right now. So another pest that's starting to become more and more prevalent for us are grasshoppers. Now this past year, grasshoppers were a major concern on seedling cotton in our sandy soils. We had a lot of parts of fields that had to be replanted and things this year, which gave us some headaches as far as trying to manage different age cotton within the same field. Grasshoppers are not too difficult to control as immatures. The adults are a little bit more difficult to control, so we try to get out early with something like a Demolin to provide a good residual control of those immature grasshoppers. Now, if we get behind and there's a bunch of adults in the field, at that point we have to swap to products like acephate to control them. But just some key things to think about moving into this coming up year. If we have a dry winter, we think grasshoppers overwinter better. And drier years, with they lay their eggs in these tubes down in the sand, and as long as we have good drainage there, doesn't flood out and kill those tubes, so the eggs overwinter. So these light sandy soils, reduced or no-till fields where we're not getting any mechanical disruption of those egg pods. For some reason, fields that seem like they've had issues in the past seem to be more likely to have issues in the future. So if you've had some fields in the past you look at that have had issues with grasshoppers, you may consider going ahead and putting out something this year to control grasshoppers as well. These eggs are going to hatch from late March all the way to June. It's going to take a little over a month for them to go through from egg to adult, so it's a pretty good amount of time there that these eggs can hatch out. So we need to be watching, and some years they turn on the cotton and do a lot of damage. Some years they just hop out of the field and go somewhere else. We don't really know what causes them to turn on the cotton or what causes them to go on. Don't really have any good thresholds, probably never will, just because of how random the damage is. But they are not too difficult to control, like I said, particularly if we're going after the immature populations as soon as they begin to start hatching. So this brings us to thrips, which are a pest that we're pretty familiar with. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about background information and things like that. They're the most important early season pest of cotton that we have in the southeast. Our goal is to get our cotton off to a fast, vigorous growth. Try to get from emergence to the 5th or 6th true leaf stage as quick as we can to try to avoid negative impacts from thrips injury. So here's a graph just kind of showing the point I want to make with this slide is that really, we've got several options for thrips control in cotton in the southeast, and really they all do a pretty good job. Now this is in central and north Alabama and Prattville and Belmina. The red line there at the 3 represents our threshold for thrips injury ratings. So this is on a 0 to 5 scale, with 5 being no living plants in the plots. So obviously we had some pretty high pressure up to the 4.5 close to it there at both locations. What you see is outside of Cruiser, really everything did a pretty good job reducing thrips injury. There's a lot of talk about resistance, which we absolutely have in the southeast. For our neonicotinoid insecticides, particularly thimethoxam, Cruiser, we no longer recommend, but imidacloprid, Gaucho, Eris, those things we still recommend, and we're still seeing a benefit. You can see about 117 pounds of lint per acre on average in these two site locations based on having that insecticide seed treatment. So just because we have some resistance, I'll talk a little bit more about the complications between when we get good efficacy out of our seed treatments and when we get a little bit less. But they are still providing benefit, and we still absolutely suggest you have an imidacloprid based seed treatment on your seed at planting. So here's an image of some 4 seedlings that I pulled off of the research station in Prattville. And it'd be pretty easy to convince you probably these are just 4 plants from our treatments in the trial that I showed you before, and you could probably pretty confidently tell me which treatment was which. But actually these are 4 plants that were within about 5 or 6 feet of each other on 2 different rows from the same commercially treated bag of cottonseed. That's just when I say Some years our seed treatments look good, some years they don't. I know that resistance plays a role in that, but I think there are some other factors as well. I think if you look at planting depth, if you've got seeds that are, some seeds are planted half an inch, some seeds are planted an inch and a half, they're not going to emerge at the same time. I think that plays an effect in how well our seed treatments respond. I think, weather, if we get a lot of rain or not enough rain, that may affect the imbibition when the seed begins to germinate and that initial take up of insecticide. So I think there's just a lot of different factors that go into this, but the overall point of thrips management is, although it may not always be enough to get us through to that 5th or 6th true leaf stage, it's very important that we do something up front, whether that be an imidacloprid-based seed treatment or an in-furrow spray of something like Orthene or Admire Pro, or a combination of the two. It's very, very important that we do something up front to manage thrips. And with that said, there are still going to be cases where we do need to supplement our at-plant insecticides with foliar sprays. And when we do that, typically around the first true leaf stage is the best time to do it. However, it can be hard to know, am I really going to need to do that this year? It can be hard to get back around. If you're planting a couple thousand acres or so spread over several counties, it can be hard to get back over your crop in time. So just some things to look at and think about as far as when we may need to make a foliar application is the planting date. Typically, the earlier we plant, conditions aren't quite as good for seedling growth, and we tend to see a little more thrips injury there. Rainfall patterns can affect it. Again, it can leach that at-plant insecticide out of the root zone. If we get dry, that can cause weedy hosts and field borders and things to dry down and cause the thrips to move in even more heavily than they would have. Nighttime temperatures in particular are important. Anytime when that cotton plant's not growing and thrips are present, they're able to do more damage. Now, another way that we can kind of get an idea if we're going to need to spray or not is this new thrips infestation predictor model from North Carolina State University. We just call it the Thrips model. It's a little bit easier, but really it's pretty neat and something you may want to play around with some this winter and spring as you get ready for planting. So here's a little information on the Thrips model. So basically, you go to the website there, you see there, or you can just type in cotton Thrips model NCSU or something like that, and find it pretty easy. But you go to this main web page here, and you can drag and click or type in an address or something to get your farm's location, and then give it your planting date and your projected planting date, and then tell it you want to run models for 3, 5, or 7 days after, before and after that planting date, and it will show you based on the weather, predicted weather patterns and past weather patterns, how high of a risk you are at actually seeing thrips injury for that planting date. So you see the bar here, it gives you several figures. To me, this figure here on the web page is figure 2, is one of the easiest ones to look at. And essentially, the darker red it is, the higher risk you are at thrips injury. The darker green, the lower risk you are. So it's just something that can give you a good idea. Now it can change, so you'll want to run it a couple of days leading up, the day you plant, then a couple of days after. A light rain can really change some things, but it really does a good job of giving you a good idea of which planting dates you need to be watching for, and be prepared to try to make that spray at the first true leaf stage. For more information, we wrote an article this past spring. If you just Google cotton thrips model ACES, it's pretty easy to find, where we kind of walk through step by step how to use it and how to interpret the different figures and graphs and things that it gives you. So we got some calls this year too from down in the Florida Alabama line about some 3-cornered alfalfa hoppers. Now these typically are going to be more of an issue in drier springs, and our wild hosts dry down. They tend to infest cotton fields, particularly in the borders. You see some of the characteristic injury here, the knotting on the main stem, the reddening of the cotyledons and the true leaves, and just kind of a droopy stage. And you can see an image there too of kind of what you tend to see in the field. A bunch of plants are okay, and then you got one stunted plant with that knot in those leaves, and then your plants are okay again. Now, I'm not saying never, but very, very rare for 3-cornered alfalfa hoppers to really be an economic concern. Situations where they are, you know, we may need to treat, but really we want to do everything that we can to not treat for three-cornered alfalfa hoppers. You know, they're easy to control. That's not really a problem, but you know, we run out a pyrethroid or an acephate, something like that, and we kill these three corners and we feel good about it. But sometimes that might cause us a problem. So as you may have guessed, when I said we might have a problem, I was referring to spider mites. So these are a pest that really, since we've kind of made that shift into reduced till and no-till situations, we have a lot more vegetation out in the field at planting and things like that. So instead of spider mites beginning on field borders and moving their way into the field like they used to, now we're starting to see these hot spots popping up in random spots across the field. And that a lot of times is just because we didn't get a good burn down, or you know, we planted into a green cover, and as those cover crops and weeds and things begin to naturally dry down through the season, the spider mites that are on there move onto our cotton plants, and then we have an issue. So really, the two best ways to manage spider mites is don't make any insecticide applications with disruptive chemistries when you don't have to for other pests, and you know, really weather. You know, we have thresholds and recommendations for spider mites, but they're a little complicated and really require some professional judgment. And you know, a lot of times we like to say, look at that 7 to 10 day weather outlook. If you've got several good chances of rain over the next week or so, maybe we can hold off that application. You know, preferably before it gets as bad as some of the plants and the images that you see here. But if we can get some rain, beat those mites back a little bit, help get that crop going back into a good vigorous growth, a lot of times we can delay or avoid those applications. But anytime we're in a situation where we've had 10 to 14 consecutive days of hot, dry weather, we're really at a risk for spider mite infestations. And so that's just something to think about, you know, looking through the whole field, not just on the field borders for spider mites, because they could be building really anywhere across the field as we continue moving into these reduced and no-till situations. So this gets us to the squaring portion of the season, where primarily we're focused on tarnished plant bugs. Now we may still have aphids or spider mites in the system as well, but typically the thing that we're most scouting for, most sampling for and spraying for at this point in the season are tarnished plant bugs. Plant bugs, which are really our number one pest during the squaring season. Now these adult plant bugs are going to move in June, when we really get to that pinhead square stage and start developing through squaring prior to bloom. The adults are going to come in, like I said, in June. Typically they're going to infest our earliest planted fields first. When our daisy fleabanes and things begin to dry down, they're going to be looking for a suitable host, and a lot of times that's our most mature cotton that we have out in the landscape. So that's just something to think about. You know, these adult plant bugs are going to be feeding on pinhead squares. So generally when we scout, we're looking in the upper 2 or 3 nodes at the first position square and trying to maintain 80% square retention. Now these adults are also going to be laying eggs, which are going to hatch out over the next month or so. That's when we start seeing the immature plant bugs. Once we really get into the blooming windows, when we start seeing them, at that point we're kind of changing. We're no longer worried about square retention. At that point we're looking at the number of immature bugs per 5 row foot, which would be the size of a standard black drop cloth that we used to sample with. But you know, one thing to consider is getting out applications of things like Diamond, which is an insect growth regulator that can provide 2 to 3 weeks of residual control to help keep that population down while we're kind of biding time before we get to the stink bug window, which is really the number one pest complex of cotton in the southeast. So this gets us to the blooming part of the season, where we've got a lot of different pests that we're thinking about while we're scouting. Primarily stink bugs in this part of the world are our number one pest, but we may have plant bugs still, aphids, spider mites, bollworms, and white flies in certain years. So let's kind of talk through now these last three pests: stink bugs, bollworms, and white flies. So as far as stink bugs, like I said, you know, they are our number one insect pest in the southeast. You know, this past year we had a relatively light year, but they still required several treatments to spray, particularly in the southern portion of Alabama. We are dealing with a complex of species, being the southern green stink bug, the brown stink bug, green stink bug, brown marmorated stink bug, and then also the leaf-footed bug, which isn't actually a stink bug but does very similar damage, and we kind of lump it in with this complex of species when sampling and making treatment decisions. So a couple of factors that we think plays a role in stink bugs moving into the field and damaging the field. Number one is the size of the field. So it seems like the smaller a field is, the more easily stink bugs are able to disperse throughout the field and kind of cause damage across the entire area, not just on the border. Typically, infestations begin on borders, which we would call probably 45 or 50 feet of the field, and they really don't move any further into the field until they have to. Now, another thing to consider is what's surrounding the farmscape. If you've got peanuts or corn around it, they will absolutely feed stink bugs into the field. Also, if you've got things like pecan orchards or abandoned pecan trees around, that tends to be a reservoir or a source of stink bugs, where they'll come for that and then move into the cotton. You see the images here of the damage we're all familiar with, stink bug damage, the warts, stain lint, things like that. And that's really what we're scouting for. These things they're hard to catch in a sweep net. They're hard to knock down on a drop cloth. So really, when we're sampling, we're looking for this internal boll injury, and based on the week of bloom and how many bolls are in the field that are susceptible to stink bugs depends on when what our threshold is at that time. So during peak bloom from weeks 3 to 5 or 6, our threshold is going to be 10% injury, which is pretty low. If you're out there scouting and you pull 20 bolls and the first 2 you look at are damaged, you're done with that sample, done with that field. It's at threshold. So it doesn't take a whole lot of time to sample, but it's very important. And this stink bug threshold is probably the best one that we've got in the southeast for cotton. It's certainly the most up to date. So just some things to consider with stink bugs. Again, our number one pest, the pest that we absolutely need to be scouting for and looking for while we're spraying cotton. If you haven't made a application of a hard insecticide, a pyrethroid or an acephate or something like that by the 3rd week of bloom, you probably need to find a reason to, because you likely have stink bugs causing threshold injury at that point in the season if you haven't sprayed plant bugs with a bifenthrin or something like that coming into the season or coming into the bloom. That's really gotten a lot of publicity in certain parts of the cotton belt, thankfully for us, and in this part of the world really hasn't materialized into much of a big deal yet, but that's bollworms. Thankfully, our 2-gene cottons, which are primarily what we're planting, are still providing very good control of these pests. There is going to be the occasional escaped worm or the occasional fill that needs to be sprayed, but really, based on all of our observations and things, really these technologies are still providing good control, even though we do have some resistance in the system. The 3rd gene, VIP, which is in Bollgard 3, Wide Strike 3s, things like that, still very, very effective against bollworm. We had some populations tested from across Alabama, including South Alabama, and no resistance found for that VIP 3A gene yet. Our best advice right now is just to make your varieties, select your varieties that you think have the highest yield potential on your farm, and we'll kind of manage the worms if and when we need to when we get to that point. Now you see this image here on the bottom. This is from Bruton, and we've got our sentinel plots where we plant several different varieties with the commercially available BT technologies in them. And you see there the amount of damaged bolls at the end of the season from our non-BT cotton, our wide strike cotton, and then you see the squares there where our wide strike 3, Bollgard 2, and Bollgard 3 would be. We didn't find any, and really that was pretty much what we saw across the state. So right now, as far as bollworms, never say never. We never know when we'll have another 2017 where we do see some issues, but our recommendation is not to worry about that on the front end. Just pick a high yielding variety in your area, and we'll manage the worms as they come. So this brings us to the last pest that we'll talk about, which is the silverleaf whitefly. Now this is one that we're kind of looking for in that tri-state area with Florida, Georgia, and Alabama every year, particularly as we get late in the season. Some of these cole crops, cucurbits, tomatoes, snap beans, things like that are produced in that area year long serve as hosts for these silverleaf whiteflies, and then when we get later in the season, as we're removing those crops from the field, the whiteflies will then move to cotton and can really do a lot of damage. So it's just something we need to think about, particularly in dry years, and we'll look at some factors that influence these pests in cotton as well. Of what these insects look like, you can see the adults are really small, white, almost moth-like looking. If you got a pretty good infestation in the field, you'll walk through, and as you're bumping plants, you'll see them kind of flutter off. Now the immatures look a little bit like aphids, maybe a little bit. They're very small, can be translucent or even a yellow color like you see in the image there. One way to tell these apart from aphids is if you wipe the leaf on your shirt, the aphid will come off while the whitefly will stay on the bottom of the leaf. So our threshold is we're scouting. We're looking at the fully expanded leaf on the 5th node below the terminal. So we walk through, pull those leaves off, and look for either 3 or more adults or 5 or more immatures, and that's when we consider a plant infested. So our threshold is 50% of the leaves infested that we look at. Now, some risk factors that go into whether or not we're at a high risk of whitefly infestation: mild winters, hairy varieties planted late are really susceptible to whitefly infestation and damage. How close you are to some of these crops that are infested. If you're making a lot of insecticide applications, removing beneficial insects from the system, that's a situation where you can get in trouble with whiteflies later in the year. And drought stress is also an issue. So a lot of this goes back to, if we're hot and dry in July and August, these things can really start to build. And then if we don't get rains in August and September, we can really see some issues. Now, the good thing is, as long as we get good timely rains, we tend to kind of get away from this one. So in 2020, those hurricanes really hurt us overall, but we went and looked at some fields in that tri-state area and saw some infestations of silverleaf whiteflies. Thankfully, they never really materialized because we did get some of those timely rains. But if you do find populations of these whiteflies, you've got to be timely with your insecticide applications. So here's a little data showing how important it is that we're timely with our insecticide applications. This is from Dr. Philip Roberts, University of Georgia. The data he shared with us, and what you see is we've got 2 weeks sprayed before threshold, 1 week before threshold, the week we hit threshold, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks after threshold when you initiate that spray, and then an untreated. And there was no difference in yield when he sprayed early based on threshold, but once we started getting 1 and 2 weeks late, we started seeing significant effects of yield, and it came out to an average of 81 pounds of yield that he lost each week he was late spraying. So if we hit threshold on July 31st and we don't spray until August 14th, that's over 160 pounds of lint that we're going to lose from these pests. And this is really a difficult pest to get behind on, to get caught up on. If you get behind, very hard to get back ahead of these things. So very important that we're scouting. If we get into these long dry periods late in the season and late planted hairy cotton in particular, we really need to be out looking for silverleaf whiteflies. So that's pretty much what I have for my presentation today. You can see my contact information there. If you have any questions or comments or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out, call, email, shoot me a text, whatever, and I'll be more than happy to help out in any way that I can. You see there are newsletters that we've got that go out. We're starting a new podcast, Alabama Crop Support podcast, coming this spring. We're excited about that. It's kind of a conversational interview with our regional agents and extension specialists across the state, and hopefully we'll talk with folks in Florida as well and be able to kind of spread information and get out the word that we need to in a timely manner to help all of our growers manage their crops the best they can. So thank you very much for listening. Again, if I can ever be of any help at all, please let me know. Thank you.